A small hand seized his stirrup leather as the arena gate chains rattled. Old Boone Carter felt the tug and the old dake together. The boy pressed a burned cattle brand into Boone's gloved palm. Iron scar twisted like a question the whole county feared answering. Boone stepped through dust and sunlight toward the rodeo one last time. Spurs rang once, sharp as judgment across the crowded grandstands. Then the announcer saw the mark and forgot every practiced word. Because that brand belonged to the outlaw everyone believed Boone buried. The rodeo gate chains rattled as Boone Carter pushed through them. Dust rolled across the arena floor, dry and restless. Spurs chimed softly with every slow step of his boots. Once that sound made crowds cheer. Today it only stirred whispers along the wooden grandstands. Old Boone Carter had not ridden a rodeo in 20 years. Men leaned forward on the rail, squinting. Women shaded their eyes. Someone muttered that ghosts sometimes come back for one last lap. Boone heard none of it. His eyes stayed on the dirt. The gate clanged behind him. Metal scraping metal. The same sound that used to start a ride. His horse shifted beneath him, leather creaking, breath blowing slow in the warm air. Boone swung down from the saddle. Boots hit the ground with a dull thud. Then something tugged his stirrup leather. A small hand. Tight. Desperate. Boone looked down. Dusty curls. Sunburned cheeks. A boy no older than 7 clung to his boot like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. The child's breath came quick and sharp. Boot leather squeaked as the grip tightened. In the boy's shaking hand sat a burned cattle brand. Black iron. Twisted. Scarred from too many fires. Boone felt the old ache crawl up his spine. Because he knew that brand. Every rancher within 100 miles knew that brand. The mark of Elias Ward. An outlaw Boone Carter once hunted across 3 territories. A man the county believed Boone had already buried. The boy pushed the iron forward. Arms trembling. Dust sifted from the metal as it knocked against Boone's glove. Clink. Clink. The sound carried strangely in the quiet arena. The announcer cleared his throat above the crowd. But the words never came. People leaned closer. Someone whispered the name Ward. Boone closed his fingers slowly around the brand. The iron felt cold. Colder than it should have been beneath the noon sun. The boy looked up. Eyes wide. Not crying. Just waiting. Boone stared at the mark again. Old memories stirred like wind under dry leaves. Gun smoke. Hooves in the night. A man falling beside a canyon wall. Boone exhaled. Long. Heavy. His spurs rang once as he turned toward the arena gate. The chains clattered open. Dust followed them out. The boy never let go of Boone's coat. Miles later the ranch house waited quiet beneath the pale evening sky. The porch boards groaned when Boone stepped up. Wind brushed the dry grass around the empty yard. He pushed the door open. Hinges groaned like an old complaint. The boy hesitated in the doorway. Boone set the brand down beside the stove. Iron touching wood with a soft knock. Then he stepped aside. The house smelled of cold ash and loneliness. "Come in," Boone said. The child crossed the threshold. The door shut behind them with a slow wooden thud. Cold air slipped through the ranch house cracks all night. Wind brushed the walls. The stove sat dark. Boone Carter woke before dawn. The habit of a lifetime. Boots touched the floor. Boards creaked under his weight. The house answered with silence. Too much of it. Then a small sound. Fabric rustling near the stove. Boone turned. The boy slept on the floor beside the cold iron brand. Curled tight. Like something used to sleeping where warmth might vanish. Boone stared a moment. Then he knelt. The brand rested inches from the child's hand. Black iron. The Ward mark. Boone picked it up. Metal tapped softly against his glove. Cold. Still cold. He set it on the mantel. Far from the boy's reach. The stove door groaned open. Ash slid inside the belly of the iron box. Wood followed. Then a match scratched. Flame caught slow. Crack. Pop. Warm light crawled across the room. The boy stirred. Eyes opened fast. Sharp. Like a rabbit hearing brush move. Boone stood back. The fire began its steady whisper. Crackle. Warmth crept into the boards. The boy pushed himself upright. Dust fell from his sleeves. Neither of them spoke. Boone poured water into a dented pot. The kettle lid rattled faintly. Soon steam breathed from the spout. The house filled with the smell of coffee. The boy watched every motion. Boone placed a tin cup on the table. Another across from it. The chair legs scraped the floor. The boy hesitated. Then climbed into the seat. Feet dangling. Boone slid a plate forward. Bread. Cold beans. The spoon clinked once against the tin. The boy ate fast. Too fast. Boone said nothing. Outside the wind pushed through dry grass. Soft hiss. A lonely sound. Boone drank his coffee. Slow. The boy kept glancing toward the mantel. Toward the brand. Boone noticed. Of course he noticed. He reached up. Took the iron down. Set it between them. The metal touched the table. Knock. The boy froze. Hands stiff around the spoon. You bring trouble with that, Boone said. His voice low. Rough from years of dust. The boy stared at the iron. Then spoke for the first time. My paws. The words came thin. But steady. Boone leaned back. Chair groaned. Your pile, I swore. The boy nodded once. The room cooled suddenly. Even with the fire snapping in the stove. Boone watched the flame. Wood split. Spark jumped. Elias Ward. The name had ridden the plains like a bad wind for years. Gunfighter. Rustler. Outlaw. Boone remembered the last night. Canyon walls. Hooves pounding rock. A shot. A fall. A body beside the dark water. Boone had watched the current carry the man away. Or thought he had. He looked back at the boy. You got a name? Caleb. Silence again. The fire spoke where neither man did. Crackle. Pop. Caleb reached toward the brand. Fingers brushed the iron. Then pulled back. As if it might bite. Boone rose. Boots thudded heavy on the floor. Come on. The door opened. Cold morning air rushed inside. Wind stirred ash from the stove. Outside the ranch spread wide and empty. Frost clung to fence rails. The barn door groaned when Boone pushed it. Inside smelled of hay and leather. A horse stamped its hoof. Snort. Breath rolled wide in the cold. Caleb stood close behind Boone. Watching. Boone handed him a brush. Use that. The boy blinked. But took it. The horse shifted when Caleb touched its flank. Brush rasped across the coat. Slow. Awkward. But careful. Boone saddled another horse nearby. Leather creaked. Buckles clicked. The barn filled with small working sounds. Brush. Hoof scrape. Chain rattle. Warmth gathered slowly from effort. Not from the sun. Caleb smiled once. A small thing. But real. Then the barn door slammed hard. Bang. Both of them turned. Wind pushed through the open crack. Dust swirled along the floor. Boone stepped outside. The yard stretched quiet. Too quiet. He scanned the ridge. Nothing moved. But far off. Very far. A faint shape crossed the hill. A rider. Then gone. Boone stood still. Listening. Only the wind answered. He walked back inside. The barn felt warmer now. But the warmth didn't reach his spine. Caleb kept brushing. trying to smooth the horse's tangled mane. Boone tightened the saddle strap. Leather groaned. "Anyone follow you here?" Boone asked. Caleb shook his head. But the pause came too long. The brush slowed. Boone said nothing more. He finished the saddle. Led the horse outside. The sun had climbed higher. Gold light touched the roof. But the air stayed sharp. Cold. Caleb stepped into the yard. Horse breath drifted white around them. Boone lifted the boy onto the saddle. The leather creaked under the weight. Caleb gripped the horn tight. Boone took the reins. They walked slow around the yard. Gravel crunched under hooves. The house watched them from its quiet porch. Windows dark. But no longer empty. When they finished the circle, Boone helped Caleb down. The boy stood beside the horse. Wind tugged his shirt. Boone turned toward the house. "Dinner's at sundown." Caleb nodded. Like he had always been here. They stepped inside together. The stove still whispered with heat. Firelight flickered across the walls. And above the mantel, the ward brand waited. Silent. Watching. Morning frost clung to the fence wire. The ranch yard stood quiet under a pale sky. Boone Carter stepped onto the porch. Boards groaned beneath his boots. Spurs chimed once. Inside the house the stove breathed a low orange glow. Warmth crept through the cracks of the door behind him. Outside the air bit cold. Caleb followed a moment later. Small boots scraping the steps. He hugged his arms tight against the chill. Boone tossed him a pair of worn gloves. Leather slapped softly against the boy's chest. "Fence line today," Boone said. Caleb nodded. The barn door groaned open. Warm animal breath rolled out. Hay rustled. A horse stamped its hoof. The barn carried its own kind of warmth. Not comfort, but life. Caleb reached for the brush without being told. The horse flicked an ear. Brush rasped over hide. Slow strokes. Boone saddled up beside him. Leather creaked. Buckles snapped shut. The small sounds of work filled the barn. Noise against the morning silence. Caleb looked toward the loft. A loose plank shifted in the wind. Tap. Tap. He flinched. Boone noticed. "Just the wind," he said. The boy nodded. But his eyes stayed on the shadows above. Boone tightened the last strap. They rode out along the fence line. Hooves crunched frost. The plains stretched wide and empty. Cold wind swept across the land. It carried nothing. No smoke. No riders. Only the lonely whistle of distance. Boone worked the wire with gloved hands. Metal twanged as he pulled it tight. Caleb held the post steady. Small hands gripping rough wood. "Your pa ever fix fens?" Boone asked. Caleb shook his head. "Didn't stay long anywhere." Wire snapped tight with a sharp twang. The sound rang across the field. Boone studied the boy. "Men chasing them?" Caleb didn't answer. Instead he looked down the ridge. The same direction Boone had watched yesterday. Silence spread again. Wind hissing through dry grass. Boone drove the staple into the wood. Hammer thudded. Cold iron against colder wood. Caleb finally spoke. "They burned the wagon." The hammer stopped. Boone waited. The boy's voice stayed quiet. "Men with rifles." The wind gusted harder. Fence wire rattled along the posts. Boone drove the staple the rest of the way. Thud. Thud. The sound carried across the empty land. Then he stood, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved. Still. The plains liked to pretend they were empty. Sometimes they lied. They rode back at noon. The ranch house waited silent beneath the sun. Inside the stove held steady heat. Beans simmered slow in a pot. The lid rattled softly. Caleb sat at the table. Hands wrapped around a cup. Steam curled toward his face. Boone stepped inside. Boots thumped the floor. Warmth met the cold riding in on his coat. The boy glanced at the mantel. The brand rested there. Dark. Still. Boone saw it too. He reached up. Took the iron down. Held it close to the fire. The metal caught a faint red glow. Caleb leaned forward. Eyes wide. "You know what that mark means?" Boone asked. The boy nodded slowly. "My pa said nobody owns it." Boone watched the iron. Heat climbing through the metal. "But some men want to." He set the brand back down. Iron clicked against the wood. The fire cracked louder. Outside the wind dropped suddenly. The silence felt heavier now. Caleb froze. Head tilted. "What?" Boone asked. The boy listened. Then pointed toward the door. Far away. Faint. A horse. Just one. Hooves echoing across hard ground. Boone moved to the window. Glass rattled in the frame. Dust drifted along the road. A rider crossed the far ridge. Too distant for a face. Too slow for a traveler. Boone watched until the figure slipped behind the hill. The boy spoke softly. "They look for me like that." The words hung in the warm air. Boone closed the curtain. Fabric rasped across the rod. He walked back to the stove. Fed another log into the fire. Flames leapt. Light filled the room. "Eat," Boone said. Caleb obeyed. Spoon tapping the bowl. Small steady noise. Boone sat across from him. Coffee steaming in his hands. The house held warmth again. Fire. Food. Breathing. But beyond the walls the plains remained cold. Silent. Watching. And above the mantel, the Ward brand waited in the firelight. Dark iron remembering every flame that ever shaped it. Snow came in the night. Thin. Restless. Wind pushed it against the windows like handfuls of salt. Boone Carter woke to the stove snapping low. The fire had dropped to embers. Cold crept along the floorboards. He swung his boots down. Boards creaked under the weight. The house answered with its usual quiet. Then another sound. Soft breathing near the hearth. Caleb slept beside the stove again. Blanket pulled tight to his chin. One hand curled close to the iron brand resting on the table. Boone stood there a long moment, watching the rise and fall of the boy's chest. The quiet of a sleeping child filled the room in a strange way. Not empty. Not lonely. Just still. Boone fed the stove. Wood slid in. Flame caught slow. Crackle. Pop. Warmth crept back into the room. The boy stirred. Eyes opened. Not afraid this time. Just careful. "You always wake that early?" Caleb asked. Boone poured water into the kettle. Tin rang against iron. Earlier. Steam soon whispered from the spout. Coffee filled the air. Warm. Bitter. Alive. Caleb climbed onto the chair. Feet thumping the rung. Boone slid a biscuit across the table. The plate scraped softly. Outside the wind rattled the loose porch board. Clack. Clack. Caleb glanced toward the door. Still listening. Boone noticed. "They ain't here," Boone said. The boy nodded. But he kept glancing at the window. They worked through the morning. The barn smelled of hay and animal heat. Warm breath from the horses fogged the air. Brush rasped across coats. Hooves thudded in the stalls. Caleb worked slower now. But steadier. He had learned where the horses liked to be touched. The black mare nudged his shoulder. He laughed once. Quick. Small. The sound bounced off the barn rafters. Boone paused. Listening. It had been years since laughter lived in that building. A loose chain rattled against the stall door. Clink. Clink. The mare shifted, ears twitching. Boone turned. The barn door stood half open. Wind pushed through the gap. Cold air rolled inside. Hay rustled across the floor. Boone stepped outside. The yard lay pale under a thin coat of snow. Fence posts stood like black bones in the field. He scanned the ridge. Nothing moved. But the cold had a way of hiding tracks. He walked the edge of the yard. Boots crunching frost. Then he saw them. Hoof prints. Fresh. One horse. Maybe two. Not close. But close enough. Boone crouched. Gloved fingers brushed the print. Still sharp. Not more than an hour old. The wind whispered across the plains. Boone stood slowly. Behind him the barn door creaked again. Caleb stepped out. Something wrong? Boone looked back at the tracks. Then at the boy. Just riders passing. The lie settled heavy in the cold air. They finished chores faster. Silence followed them back into the house. The stove burned hotter now. Firelight rolled across the walls. Warmth wrapped the room. Caleb sat near the hearth. Boone pulled the iron brand from the mantel. He held it toward the fire. Flames licked the metal. Red slowly crept across the mark. The twisted W. Caleb leaned forward. My pa kept it wrapped in cloth. Boone turned the iron in the light. Why? The boy swallowed. He said men would hunt it if they saw. The fire popped loud. Sparks snapped inside the stove. Boone rested the brand across his knees. You know why they'd hunt it? Caleb stared at the floor. My pa said it meant nobody owned our land. Boone said nothing. The wind outside dropped suddenly. Silence pressed against the walls. The boy continued. He said some men wanted it bad. Boone watched the fire. Heat rising against his palms. The brand clinked when he set it on the table. What men? Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper. The rich ones. The words barely carried across the room. Boone leaned back in his chair. Wood creaked. Outside the barn door slammed again in the wind. Bang. The boy flinched. Boone stood. Walked to the window. Pulled the curtain aside. The yard lay empty. Snow drifting slow across the ground. But beyond the fence line something dark moved along the ridge. A rider. Still distant. Watching. Boone closed the curtain. Fabric brushed the rod with a dry whisper. He turned back toward the fire. Caleb stared at him. Eyes wide. Boone took the brand again. Held it where the firelight struck deep into the iron. The mark glowed faint red. A brand. A claim. A warning. Boone set it down. Iron knocked softly against the table. Then he looked at the boy. Reckon you better stay close to the house tomorrow. Caleb nodded. The fire cracked louder. The warmth filled the room. But outside the snow kept falling. Cold. Quiet. And somewhere beyond the ridge. Hooves moved slowly through the white. Morning came with hard frost and a sky the color of tin. Boone Carter stepped onto the porch. Boot heels thudded against the boards. Spurs chimed once. The ranch yard held its breath. Even the wind stayed quiet. Caleb opened the door behind him. Warm air from the stove slipped outside in a slow wave. The boy carried a tin bucket. Milk sloshed softly from the rim. Boone nodded toward the barn. Chickens first. Caleb crossed the yard. Boots crunching frost. The barn door creaked open. Hay rustled. A horse stamped its hoof. Warm breath rolled out into the cold morning. Boone leaned against the porch post. Listening. The plains stretched white and pale beyond the fence. Too still. Stillness on the frontier often meant watching eyes. Then the sound came. Far away. Hooves. Slow. Measured. Not the wandering rhythm of a traveler. The steady approach of men who already knew where they were going. Boone stepped down from the porch. Gravel ground under his boots. The sound grew clearer. Leather creaking. Harness jingling. Caleb appeared in the barn doorway. He heard it too. The bucket stopped swinging. Milk stilled. A line of riders crested the ridge. 5 men. Black shapes against the white ground. At the center rode a man with a dark coat and a tall hat. Even from a distance he sat too straight in the saddle. Like a man used to being obeyed. The riders moved down the hill without hurry. Hooves breaking frost. The quiet of the yard cracked open. Caleb stepped closer to Boone. Small boots scraping gravel. Boone rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay by the door." The riders reached the fence. One of them pushed the gate. Rusty hinges screamed. Metal scraping metal. The sound carried across the yard. Boone did not move. The horses entered slowly. Leather groaned. Bits clinked. The man in the tall hat studied the ranch house. His eyes swept the barn. The well. The empty pasture. Then they settled on Boone. He smiled. Not warm. Not friendly. Just the thin curve of a man measuring land he expected to own. "Morning," he said. His voice carried smooth across the yard. Boone said nothing. The man swung down from the saddle. Boots hit the ground with a crisp thud. He brushed dust from his coat. "My name's Victor Hale." Caleb stiffened beside the porch. The bucket slipped in his hands. Milk sloshed over the rim. Hale noticed the boy. His eyes sharpened. "Well now," he said quietly. "There he is." The words settled cold in the air. Boone stepped forward. Gravel crunched under his boots. "You got business here?" Hale smiled again. He reached inside his coat. Paper slid free. It crackled softly in the morning silence. "I believe I do." He held the paper out. The wind tried to tug it loose. Hale kept it steady. "A ranch contract," he said. "Signed years ago by a certain Elias Ward." Caleb's breathing quickened behind Boone. The barn horse snorted. Hooves struck the stall. Boone took the paper. The parchment felt stiff and brittle in his hands. Ink lines crawled across the page. Legal words. Ownership clauses. Debt tallies. Boone looked up. Hale's smile never moved. "That boy," Hale said, "is collateral." Silence dropped heavy over the yard. The wind stirred at last. Fence wire rattled along the posts. Caleb's boots scraped the porch. "No," he whispered. Hale tilted his head. His riders shifted in their saddles. Leather creaked. Metal spurs chimed. Boone folded the paper slowly. The sound of creasing parchment cut through the cold. "You're mistaken," Boone said. Hale chuckled. "A dry sound." "Oh, I don't believe I am." He glanced toward the barn. Toward the pasture beyond. This whole stretch once belonged to Ward. His eyes slid back to Caleb. Until he borrowed money he couldn't repay. The riders laughed softly. Low. Cruel. Caleb pressed closer to the door. Boone stepped between them. Boots planted firm in the gravel. "You got your answer," Boone said. Hale sighed. Like a man dealing with stubborn livestock. He took the paper back. Tucked it into his coat. "You misunderstand," Hale said calmly. "I wasn't asking." A gust of wind swept across the yard. The barn door banged against its hinge. Bang. The sound made the horses shift. Hooves thudded against the frozen ground. Hale turned toward his men. "Seems Mr. Carter needs time to think." One rider nudged his horse forward. The animal stomped near the porch. Caleb froze. The bucket slipped from his hands. Tin clanged against the boards. Milk splashed across the wood. The sharp sound rang through the yard. Boone's hand drifted near his belt. Hale noticed. His smile returned. "Easy," he said. "Violence would only complicate matters." He swung back into the saddle. Leather creaked. The horse snorted. Hale looked down at Boone one last time. "I'll return tomorrow," he said. "With proper witnesses." His eyes flicked toward Caleb. "And property should be waiting." The riders turned their horses. Hooves cracked frost as they crossed the yard. The gate screamed open again. Metal scraping loud against the still air. They rode out slow. Unhurried. Dust and frost drifting behind them. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Silence settled again. Heavy. Caleb stood frozen on the porch. Milk dripping slowly through the cracks of the boards. Boone watched the empty ridge. His jaw tightened. Then he turned. The stove inside still glowed warm through the open door. Fire crackling. Life holding on. Boone stepped toward the house. "Inside," he said quietly. Caleb followed. The door shut behind them with a low wooden thud. The stove burned hot that night. Wood snapped. Flame rolled against the iron belly. Warmth filled the room. But it did not chase away the cold that followed Victor Hale's words. Boone Carter sat at the table. Elbows resting on scarred wood. The folded contract lay before him. Paper dry. Crisp. Caleb watched from the hearth. Blanket pulled around his shoulders. The iron brand rested on the mantel above the fire. Dark. Silent. Wind brushed the walls of the house. A slow whisper along the boards. Caleb spoke first. "He'll come back." Boone looked at the paper. The ink lines crawled like snakes across the page. "Men like him always do." The fire cracked loud. Sparks snapped inside the stove. Caleb stared at the floor. "My pa said never trust a man with clean boots." Boone almost smiled. Almost. Instead he pushed the paper aside. The chair creaked as he stood. Boots thudded across the room. He lifted the brand from the mantel. The iron felt heavy. Old. He held it toward the fire. Flames touched the metal. Red crept slowly across the twisted mark. Caleb leaned closer. Eyes reflecting the glow. "That mark don't mean debt," Boone said. "It means land." The boy frowned. "My pa said it meant freedom." Boone turned the iron. Watching the light shift across the scarred metal. "Freedom's just land no one else can claim." The brand clicked softly when he set it down. Outside the wind dropped again. Silence spread across the yard. Caleb noticed. His head tilted. Listening. Boone noticed too. The plains had a way of going quiet before trouble. Then it came. A faint clatter. Metal on wood. Outside. Caleb stiffened. Boone crossed the room. Boots soft now. The curtain slid aside with a dry whisper. The yard sat dark beneath the moon. Snow patches glowed pale along the fence. For a moment nothing moved. Then the horse snorted. From the barn. Hoof thudded against the stall. Boone stepped outside. Cold air hit like water. Sharp. Clean. The porch boards creaked under his weight. The barn door swayed in the wind. Creak. Creak. He walked toward it. Gravel grinding under his boots. Inside the barn the horses shifted restless. Chains rattled. Hay rustled. Boone lit the lantern. Glass chimed softly. Flame caught. Yellow light pushed back the shadows. He moved through the stalls. One horse stomped hard. Nostrils flaring. Then Boone saw it. A nail hammered into the center post. Something hung from it. A piece of cloth. Dark. Burned around the edges. Boone pulled it free. The lantern light revealed the mark. A.W. Branded deep into the fabric. Caleb's father's brand. But this time it wasn't iron. It was a warning. Caleb's voice came from the doorway. "What is it?" Boone folded the cloth slowly. The barn creaked around them. He turned toward the boy. "Just a message." Caleb stepped closer. Lantern light flickered across his face. His eyes widened when he saw the mark. "They found us." The words came thin, but certain. Boone hung the lantern back on the beam. Metal hooks scraped wood. "Maybe." Outside, the wind picked up again. Barn doors groaned. The horses settled slowly. Boone led Caleb back to the house. Boots crunching frost. The door shut behind them. Warmth wrapped the room again. The stove crackled steady, but the warmth felt smaller now, like a fire trying to stand against a storm. Boone spread the burned cloth across the table. The Bren stared up at them. Caleb touched the edge carefully. "My pa said that mark meant no man could own us." Boone poured coffee into 2 cups. Tin clinked. Steam curled upward. "Your pa was right about the mark," Boone said. "But men like Hale don't care about truth." Caleb held the cup tight, hands shaking. The fire popped loud. Outside, something shifted in the yard. A faint scrape of wood. Boone froze. Cup halfway to his lips. He set it down. Slow. Boots crossed the floor. The door opened without a sound. Cold air slipped inside. The yard stretched silent again. Moonlight washed over the fence line. Nothing moved. But something lay near the gate. A shape in the snow. Boone walked closer. Boots crunching frost. The shape became clear. A dead chicken. Its neck twisted. The ward brand burned into its feathers. The iron mark still smoking faint in the cold air. Boone stared a long moment. The wind whispered across the field. Far away, a rider moved along the ridge. Just a shadow against the sky. Watching. Boone carried the bird back to the house. The door closed behind him. Wood thudded heavy in the frame. Caleb saw the mark and looked away. The stove snapped louder. Flames rising bright against the iron belly. Boone set the bird beside the cloth. 2 warnings. Same mark. Same message. The room filled with the steady sound of fire. Warm. Alive. But outside, the ranch lay wrapped in cold. And somewhere beyond the dark ridge, Victor Hale waited for morning. Night settled slow over the ranch. Cold climbed out of the ground. Wind dragged through the dry grass with a thin hiss. Inside the house, the stove burned steady. Wood cracked. Firelight rolled across the walls. Boone Carter sat in the chair beside the hearth. The ward brand rested across his knees. Caleb slept near the stove again. Blanket pulled tight. One hand curled close to the iron leg of the chair. The boy slept lighter now. Every small sound tugged at his breathing. Outside, a loose board tapped the porch rail. Clack. Clack. Boone stared into the flames. The heat touched his face. But the warmth never reached the place inside him where old memories lived. The wind dropped. Silence settled over the ranch like a hell breath. Then came the smell. Smoke. Not from the stove. Different. Sharp. Boone stood. Boots thudded the floor. He opened the door. Cold air rushed inside. The yard glowed orange. The far barn wall burned. Flames licked up the wood like hungry hands. Dry boards snapped and popped. Sparks climbed into the night. Caleb stumbled to the doorway behind him. "What's happening?" Boone grabbed the bucket beside the well. Water sloshed hard against the tin. He ran toward the barn. Boots pounding frozen dirt. Caleb followed halfway. The heat struck them both before they reached the door. Flame roared along the side wall. Hay inside had caught. The barn breathed fire now. Boone threw water against the boards. Steam burst back into his face. Another bucket. Another splash. Useless. The fire had already claimed the roof. Wood beams cracked like rifle shots. Caleb stood frozen in the yard, eyes wide. The horse inside screamed. A terrible sound. Boone kicked the barn door. It burst open with a splintering crack. Heat rolled out like a storm. Smoke clawed the air. Boone ran inside. Chains rattled. The horse thrashed against the stall. Boone cut the rope with his knife. Leather snapped. The animal bolted past him. Hooves thundered out into the yard. Another horse kicked loose from its rail. Boone dragged it toward the door. Fire fell from the rafters. A beam groaned above him. The roof gave way with a deep cracking roar. Boone leapt clear just as the stall collapsed. The barn exploded in sparks behind him. Flames devoured the rest. Caleb stood near the well, face pale in the firelight. Boone led the horses away from the blaze. Their breath came wild and hot in the cold night. The barn roof fell inward with a heavy crash. Embers shot skyward. Wind carried the sparks across the dark field. Boone turned slowly. Something moved along the ridge. Shapes. Riders. Watching. Their silhouettes stood black against the firelit sky. 5 of them. Maybe more. Caleb saw them too. They did it, he whispered. Boone said nothing. The fire roared louder. The riders lingered a moment longer, then turned their horses. Hooves faded into the distance. Silence crept back across the ranch. Only the crackle of burning wood remained. Caleb stepped closer. Snow melted beneath the heat of the blaze. Water dripped from the well bucket onto the ground. Boone watched the barn collapse. Years of work turning to ash. A final beam snapped. Flame swallowed it whole. Caleb spoke again. "They'll come tomorrow." Boone looked down at him. Firelight flickered across the boy's face. Fear lived there now. Not the quiet caution from before. Real fear. Boone placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe." The boy stared at the burning barn. "My pa used to say when men burn things, it means they're scared." Boone glanced toward the dark ridge again. The riders were gone, but their presence still hung in the cold air. Smoke drifted low across the yard. Boone turned toward the house. The door stood open. Warm firelight spilled onto the snow. Inside, the stove still burned. Still steady. Still alive. Boone walked back slowly. Caleb beside him. Boots crunching frost. The horses followed close behind. Restless. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Warmth wrapped the room again. But outside, the fire continued to roar. Orange light flickering through the window glass. Boone walked to the wall near the door. A long wooden box rested there. He opened it. The hinges groaned. Inside lay an old gun belt. Leather cracked with age. The revolver still rested in the holster. Untouched for years. Boone lifted the belt. Leather creaked. Caleb watched without speaking. Boone fastened it around his waist. The buckle clicked. A hard metallic sound in the quiet room. The stove snapped loudly. Flame surged bright. Boone reached for the ward brand. Iron scraped softly against the mantel. He held it toward the fire again. Red light climbed across the twisted mark. The boy's voice came small beside him. "Are we leaving?" Boone stared into the flame. The iron glowed brighter. "No." Outside, the barn collapsed with one final crash. Sparks scattered into the black sky. Boone set the brand down beside the revolver. Iron touched wood with a firm knock. Then he stepped toward the door. The wind carried the smell of smoke across the ranch. Cold. Bitter. Boone rested his hand on the revolver grip. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "And they'll wish they hadn't come." Morning came gray and cold. Smoke still drifted from the black ribs of the barn. The wind moved slow through the ash. Boone Carter stood on the porch. The revolver rested low on his hip. Leather creaked when he shifted his weight. Caleb stood behind him in the doorway. The stove's warmth touched the back of Boone's coat. But the yard lay frozen. Silent. A crow called once from the fence post. Harsh. Lonely. Then came the sound. Hooves. More than yesterday. Many. Steady. Confident. Boone stepped down from the porch. Gravel crunched beneath his boots. Caleb followed halfway across the boards. Boone raised a hand. Inside. The boy stopped. The door remained open behind him. Warm air spilled into the cold yard. The riders crested the ridge. 10 this time. Black shapes moving against the pale field. Victor Hale rode at the front. Tall hat. Dark coat. Perfect posture. Behind him the men spread wide across the hill. Rifles rested easy in their hands. Hooves broke the frost as they rode down. The sound filled the valley. Heavy. Unhurried. They crossed the burned barn without slowing. Ash puffed beneath the horses' steps. The smell of smoke mixed with the morning cold. Hale stopped 20 yards from the porch. Leather creaked as he swung down. Boots struck the ground. Clean. Polished. The riders fanned out behind him. Hooves stamping. Bits clinking. Boone stood alone in the yard. Wind tugged at his coat. The revolver hung quiet at his side. Hale studied the ruins of the barn. "Terrible accident," he said. His voice carried smooth across the yard. Boone said nothing. The silence stretched. Hale's eyes slid to the house. Caleb watched from the doorway. The boy's fingers gripped the frame. White knuckles against old wood. "There he is," Hale said softly. Boone stepped forward. Boots grinding ash. "You're done here." Hale chuckled. A dry sound. "I believe the law might disagree." One of the riders tossed a folded paper toward Boone. It landed in the ash at his feet. Boone didn't look down. Hale nodded toward it. A writ of property seizure. The wind lifted the corner of the page. It rustled faintly. The sound of paper against ash. Boone kicked dirt over it. The motion small. Deliberate. Hale sighed. "Mr. Carter." His tone turned patient. "Stand aside." Boone didn't move. Behind Hale the riders shifted. Leather groaned. One man slid his rifle from the saddle scabbard. Metal scraped wood. The sound cut the air sharp. Caleb heard it. The door creaked as he stepped farther outside. Boone spoke without turning. "Back inside." Caleb didn't move. The boy's voice carried thin across the yard. "You burned our barn." The riders laughed softly. Hale tilted his head. Sometimes progress requires inconvenience. Boone's hand drifted lower. Closer to the revolver. The wind picked up suddenly. Fence wire hummed along the posts. Hale noticed the movement. His smile faded. "You don't want this road," he said. Boone looked at the men behind him. 10 rifles. 10 horses. 10 sets of eyes waiting. Then he glanced back toward the house. Toward the warm light in the doorway. Toward the boy standing alone in the cold. The decision settled quiet in his chest. Boot leather creaked. Boone drew. The revolver cleared the holster with a hard snap. Gunfire shattered the morning. One rider pitched from his saddle. The rifle hit the ground with a clang. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Another shot cracked. Dust leapt near Boone's boots. Boone moved sideways. Fast. Another shot from his revolver. A second rider spun from the saddle. The horse bolted. Hooves thundered across the yard. The rest scattered wide. Rifles roared. Gun smoke filled the air. Boone dropped behind the well. Stone chipped under the rifle fire. Caleb ducked inside the doorway. The door slammed shut. Wood rattled under the impact. Outside, the gunfight rolled across the ranch. Shots cracked. Echoes bouncing off the empty hills. Boone leaned out. Fired again. A rider's hat flew from his head. The man dove from the saddle. Hale backed toward his horse. Anger burned through his calm mask. "Kill him," he shouted. Rifles answered. Wood splintered along the porch rail. Boone fired once more. The last round clicked empty. The sharp metal snap echoed louder than the shots. Silence fell for half a heartbeat. Boone opened the cylinder. Empty chambers. He reached for the extra rounds in his coat. Behind him, the house door creaked open. Caleb stood there. The Ward brand clutched in his hands. The iron glowed red from the stove. Smoke curled from its tip. Hale saw it. His eyes widened. For the first time that morning, fear flickered across his face. Boone loaded the revolver slow. Click. 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 The cylinder closed with a hard metallic snap. Boone stepped out from the well. Smoke drifted across the yard. The riders hesitated now. 3 men already down. Horses restless. Wind carrying the scent of gunpowder. Boone lifted the revolver again. "Last chance," he said. The words came calm. Cold. Victor Hale stared at the glowing brand in the boy's hands. Then at Boone. The wind hummed across the broken ranch. No one moved. For a long moment. Then Hale climbed slowly back into his saddle. Leather creaked. He pulled the reins tight. The riders backed away. Hooves crunching ash. Rifles lowered. They turned toward the ridge. Victor Hale paused once. Looking back at Boone. Looking back at the boy. "Not finished," he said. Then they rode. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the cold distance. Silence returned to the ranch. Gun smoke drifted away with the wind. Boone lowered the revolver. His hand finally relaxed. Behind him, the door creaked open wider. Caleb stepped out into the yard. The brand still glowed faint red. Boone looked at it. Then at the burned barn. Then toward the empty ridge. The cold morning stretched quiet again. But the war had begun. The wind carried the last smell of gunpowder across the ranch. Hoofprints scarred the frozen yard. 3 riderless horses wandered near the fence. The burned barn still smoked. Ash drifted slow through the cold air. Boone Carter stood beside the well. The revolver rested low in his hand. Caleb stood near the porch. The Ward brand had cooled. Dark iron again. But the mark still seemed to glow in the boy's grip. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched wide across the land. Then came another sound. Hooves. Not fast. Not hunting. Steady. Measured. Boone turned toward the road. A wagon rolled over the ridge. Wood creaked. Harness chains rattled. Behind it rode 3 men. Town men. Boone recognized them even from a distance. Sheriff Lyle Grant. Old Tom Barlow from the general store. And Pastor Reed with his worn black coat flapping in the wind. They rode slow into the yard. Eyes moving over the ash. Over the broken fence rail. Over the men lying in the snow. The wagon wheels ground to a stop. Sheriff Grant climbed down first. Boots crunching frost. His coat collar pulled high against the cold. "Well," he said quietly. "Looks like hell visited early." Boone holstered the revolver. Leather creaked. "They came for the boy." Grant nodded toward the bodies. "And you answered." Caleb stepped closer to Boone. The brand still in his hand. Tom Barlow noticed it. His breath caught. "Lord above," he murmured. "That mark." The wind stirred across the yard. The iron brand knocked softly against Caleb's coat button. Clink. Sheriff Grant studied the iron. His eyes narrowed. "Ward brand," he said. Boone nodded once. The sheriff looked toward the ridge where Hale had disappeared. Thought that business ended years ago. Boone reached inside his coat. The folded contract slid into his hand. Paper crackled in the cold. Grant took it. He unfolded it slowly. The parchment snapped stiff between his fingers. His eyes moved across the ink. Lines of debt. Property claims. Ownership clauses. Grant frowned. "Looks legal enough," he said. Tom Barlow shook his head. "No." His voice came low. Uncertain. "I seen that mark before." He stepped closer to Caleb. The boy held the iron tighter. Tom knelt. Old knees popping. "That brand ain't for cattle." Grant glanced up. "What do you mean?" Tom pointed at the twisted W. "That mark was filed with the county 20 years ago." The sheriff's eyes sharpened. "For land." The word fell heavy. Caleb looked between them. "My pa said it meant freedom." Tom nodded slowly. "Your pa was right." Boone watched the sheriff. Grant studied the iron again. His gloved fingers traced the shape in the air. "I remember now," he said. "Elias Ward filed a claim with that brand." The wind rattled the fence wire. A thin metallic hum. Grant continued. "Unclaimed land east of the canyon." Boone spoke quietly. "Hale wanted it." Tom stood again. "Whole valley worth a fortune if the railroad reaches it." Grant looked back at the contract. His mouth tightened. "This paper says Ward pledged the land to Hale." Caleb's voice came small. "My pa never signed nothing like that." The wind picked up. Ash lifted from the burned barn. Boone stepped closer to the sheriff. "You believe that boy signed away his father's land?" Grant didn't answer. His eyes moved back to the brand. Then to the boy. Then to the ridge where Hale had vanished. The silence stretched. Finally he folded the contract again. Paper snapped sharp in the cold air. "This paper ain't filed in county records," he said. Tom Barlow nodded. "Because it's a lie." The sheriff handed the brand back to Caleb. Iron knocked softly against the boy's palm. Grant looked toward Boone. "Ward land belongs to the bloodline." Caleb swallowed. "That means—" Grant finished the thought. "The boy owns the valley." Wind swept across the ranch. The fence wire hummed again. Boone looked at Caleb. The boy stared at the brand in his hands. Like it had suddenly become something heavier than iron. Far off along the ridge, a single rider appeared. Victor Hale. Watching. Even at that distance. Grant saw him too. His jaw hardened. "Looks like he ain't done yet." Boone rested his hand near the revolver. But Grant raised a hand. "Not today." The sheriff climbed back onto his horse. Leather creaked. He looked down at Boone. "I'll file the claim in town." His eyes moved to Caleb. "Make it official." Tom Barlow climbed into the wagon. The wheels creaked as he turned the team. The horses started slow down the road. Grant gave Boone one last look. "Keep the boy safe." Then they rode away. The wagon wheels groaned across the frozen ground. The sound faded slowly. Boone watched the ridge. Victor Hale still sat there. A dark figure against the sky. Then the man turned his horse. And disappeared into the distance. The ranch grew quiet again. Only the wind and the crackle of the stove drifting from the open door. Caleb stepped beside Boone. The iron brand rested steady in his hands now. Not shaking. Not afraid. Boone looked at the boy. Then toward the wide empty valley beyond the ridge. "That land's yours," he said quietly. The wind carried the words across the frozen field. And for the first time since the trouble began, the cold felt like it might finally break. Spring came slow to the ranch. Snow melted into dark earth. Water ran along the fence line in thin silver streams. The burned barn stood gone now. Only black posts remained. But new wood rose beside it. Fresh boards. Fresh nails. Hammer blows echoed across the valley. Clang. Clang. Caleb held the plank steady. Boone Carter drove the nail home. The hammer struck once more. Solid. Clean. The new barn wall stood straight in the morning light. Wind moves through the open fields. But the air carried warmth now. Not the sharp bite of winter. Caleb wiped sweat from his brow. The hammer rang again. Clang. The sound bounced off the hills. A sound of building. Of staying. Boone stepped back from the wall. Boots grinding gravel. He studied the frame. Good enough, he said. Caleb grinned. The boy had grown taller already. Stronger. The ranch felt different too. Chickens scratched near the fence. A new mare grazed in the pasture. Life had crept back across the land. From the house the stove door clanged open. Pastor Reed stepped onto the porch. His voice drifted across the yard. Coffee's ready. The smell followed the words. Warm. Rich. Boone and Caleb walked toward the house. Boots thudding the packed dirt. The porch boards creaked beneath their weight. Inside the kitchen the fire crackled bright. Tom Barlow sat at the table. A ledger open before him. His glasses rested low on his nose. Railroad surveyors passed through town yesterday, Tom said. Caleb paused. The room cooled slightly at the words. Boone poured coffee into tin cups. Steam rose between them. They heading east? Boone asked. Tom nodded slowly. Through Ward Valley. Silence settled over the kitchen. The fire popped loud in the stove. Caleb looked down at the brand resting on the mantel. The iron hung there now beside the door. Not hidden. Not feared. Just waiting. Boone sipped his coffee. The land's filed, he said. Tom nodded. Sheriff Grant made sure of it. The pastor leaned back in his chair. Wood creaked softly. Hale hasn't shown his face in town since that day. Caleb spoke quietly. He will. The boy's voice carried calm now. Not fear. Just knowing. Boone steadied him a moment. Then nodded. Maybe. Outside a horse snorted near the fence. Hoof thudded against the ground. The small sounds of ranch life filled the morning. Tom closed the ledger. Paper rustled. Well, he said. Surveyors or no surveyors, this land belongs to the boy. The pastor lifted his cup. To the Ward Valley. Tin cup tapped softly. Clink. Warmth spread through the room again. The fire glowed steady. Later that afternoon the valley shimmered under the sun. Golden grass moved like waves. Caleb rode along the fence line. Boone walked beside the horse. Boots crunching dry soil. A meadowlark called from the post. Clear. Bright. They stopped at the ridge overlooking the valley. Miles of land stretched below. Green now. Alive. Caleb dismounted. Boots thumped the earth. He pulled the Ward brand from the saddlebag. The iron caught the sunlight. Dark metal. Old scars. Boone watched. What you planning? Caleb walked to a fresh fence post. The hammer rested nearby. He placed the iron against the wood. Not heated. Not burning. Just resting there. The mark pressed into the grain. This land needs a sign, Caleb said. Boone handed him the hammer. Caleb nailed a small iron hook to the post. Clang. Clang. The sound carried across the valley. Then the boy hung the brand there. The metal swayed slightly in the breeze. Clink. Clink. Boone listened. The sound echoed the same way his spurs once had. Only softer. Warmer. Caleb stepped back. That way everyone sees it. The wind lifted across the hills. The iron moved gently. Clink. Clink. Boone rested his hands on the fence rail. The valley stretched wide before them. No smoke. No riders. Just sunlight. Just grass. Just the quiet promise of years ahead. The house chimney sent up a thin ribbon of smoke. Warmth waiting down the hill. Caleb leaned against the fence. "You staying here?" Boone looked across the valley. Long. Slow. Then he nodded. "Reckon someone's gotta teach you how to run it." Caleb smiled. The breeze stirred again. The iron brand chimed against the hook. Clink. Clink. The sound carried soft across the open land. Not a warning anymore. Not a threat. Just the steady voice of a place finally at peace. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.